Hello fellow crafters, my name is George and this is the Spare Time G, and today finally we are going to make a war machine from the MCU. So as for all projects I have done on this channel, and in particular with this one, I'm starting out with a base, and for this one I'm also thinking through the idea of how and what kind of weight I need the base to be in order to support this whole project. As you have seen, it is going to be hovering above the ground, the actual base, and it is going to be supported by two wires going through this chunk of clay. So in this kind of case, you really need to think about the thickness of the base, how large the chunk needs to be to support the wires inside and not rattle, and at the same time the heaviness of it for the whole structure not to tilt and fall over easily. If that happens and you kind of have very detailed upper part like machine guns and all this stuff, it will really easily get damaged. And so I have decided to think through and make this kind of idea of making this clay rocky bit and coloring it up with grayish color in order to replicate the mountain side. So once you're done with the base, it is colored up and everything is fine, you can just stick it aside for a long time while you start working on the actual frame, the skeleton of the body. For this one I have decided to have this more or less strong connections of steel wire and attach them firmly, and at the same time remember that you need to have wires longer than the actual feet of the character. So little by little you can start adding more chunks to it, maybe later on figuring out what kind of posture you want your project to have. As you're done with your desired posture and you have also added enough chunks of clay to it as it resembles the naked pilot which will be piloting the armor, you can now firmly attach it to the base. So now the crude portion is done, and right now you really need to go into the details and make the armor plates prominent and visible. It is quite tough work to do and the least appealing for me, at least in the beginner stage, because it is quite hard to make clay be sharp and clean instead of being round and clayish, so to say. And it is also quite important to remember the movement of the arms and what kind of shapes the armor needs to be for the wearer to be able to move properly. In this case, for example, as you can see, I'm already doing some kind of advancements with the feet, but the later versions of the feet are completely different. I had three separate versions of it sculpted, then I was not happy with it and just removed it completely and changed it. The feet were the most difficult thing to think through and make on this stage for some reason. And the reason I'm starting with the feet should be familiar for you. It is quite important on this kind of projects to make the center of the mass as low as possible. And if you start sculpting from the top, the center of the mass is going to go up, which will make the overall sculpture be more wobbly and harder to work with. So the thing I want to underline once again is the necessity of open places in the armor. If you look at the reference photos in the Google of knight's armor or even fictional armors like, for example, War Machine itself, you can see that in some places around the knees, around the elbows, shoulders, the armor is not prominent and there are some open places and parts which allows the wearer to move freely and fight freely. That's the reason why we have these kind of connection points which are thinner, not covered with the armor in the later versions, and at the same time it is quite important to keep that in mind while making this dynamic posture. As you have seen, I have a lot of fun making these narrow stripes, then outlining the overall shape of the armor and then filling inside the open areas and making this kind of technique, using this kind of technique to create the concept and then overall finished version of the armor. And after all this attaching, curving, claying, loop tooling and so on, we are finally going near the end. At this stage, as you can see, I'm adding more of kind of a thicker armor and edges onto it. Also, I'm kind of making this narrow layers and adding them into the different spaces in order to emulate this kind of technology and so on. It's not really important for you to follow the exact match of mine or any kind of reference photos. Just think about your own ideas and places where it will be necessary and also look cooler than the plain versions. Of course, at the same time, it is quite important to use different colors in order to make the overall project much more interesting and define the idea of more like complexity of the armor. So we are pretty much done with the project. The only thing which is left is the head, wrists, finishing touches on the armor itself, and the cannons and machine guns, which is a lot, to be honest. And at the same time, we'll here of course need to create the holes where the chest mounted reactor is going to be. And in my case, I'm also going to use the UV paint, which will glow if you stick a UV ultraviolet light onto it. And I'm also using the wires, the narrow thin wires, in order to emulate the bullets flying from the guns and so on. So it is quite complicated to create that kind of thingies because of the weight of the wire itself. I was not really thinking about that much, but once I got the desired chunk, I noticed that it was pretty heavy, and if I had attached it like blatantly to the machine gun, it will bend and damage it really quickly. So to avoid that, you will first need to kind of create this anchor, so to say, which will go inside the armor and connect it into the near the main base, and the chunk of clay will support it much better and allow the machine gun not to bend that easily. So keep that in mind, that the wire lines, despite being quite thin, are quite heavy nonetheless, and make sure you're attaching them firmly, or unless you don't. If you don't do that, they will bend. So for the cotton ideas, you can simply use some kind of different colored paints in order to make them red, yellow, or maybe gray. It depends on your idea and desire, and at the same time it will like inflict the theme of the project better. If you use the lighter colors, it will be much more lighter and light-hearted. If you use some kind of darker colors, it will be much more militaristic and darker, like a DC universe. So we're done with the machine guns and things and rockets and so on. It was quite complicated to create them, and in this case, even now they look quite awesome. And now it's time to attach them to the armor and it will be finished. And after attaching the firearms, rockets and stuff, the project is done. I'm quite happy with this result, and this is probably one of my favorite MCU projects, maybe next to the Spider-Man. Which is my favorite? Which one is my favorite? I don't really have decided yet, because Spider-Man is was quite complicated as well. And War Machine was not really my favorite MCU character at all. The first spark came when I saw the independent movement of the back-mounted machine gun, the Gatling gun, which was firing independently. And then later on in the Infinity War, when I saw the immense amount of firepower it could dish out, I was amazed with this craziness which was going on this back, where the missiles were firing, then collapsing into the armors, and then some kind of different weapon systems were coming up and doing their stuff. And yeah, it was amazing, and I wanted to showcase that firepower of like Transformers size firepower maybe Starscream will be able to do the same, or maybe even less than that, and showcase it with making this kind of dynamic diorama slash model of MCU character. I hope you enjoyed this one as much as I enjoyed. Also, maybe you have learned some new tips and tricks, and in the next I will definitely continue making these complicated versions, maybe more frequently as long as my schedule allows me to do so. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this project as much as I enjoyed making it and am enjoying staring at it in the real life. It was quite a tough project to do, but I'm quite happy to pull this off. I have learned a lot of techniques, ideas, and insights about sculpting in this project, and hope that you do too. Have a nice day and see you next time. Goodbye.